A billionaire, consumed by success, finally tries to reconnect with the son he abandoned. But just when he thinks he's earned a second chance, a shocking truth changes everything. The city lights of Miami stretched far beyond the glass walls of the Four Seasons penthouse, where Alexander Carter sat alone, a glass of whiskey resting in his hand. Below, the city pulsed with life. Luxury cars gliding through the streets, neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Inside, however, silence reigned. It was a silence he had grown accustomed to, one he had convinced himself was the price of success. Alexander checked his watch. 9:37 p.m. Another late night, another deal signed, another addition to his growing empire. He exhaled deeply and loosened his tie, staring at the skyline that mirrored his achievements. Tall, imposing, untouchable. The notifications on his phone blinked incessantly. Board meetings, financial reports, congratulatory messages. Yet, amidst the influx of corporate validation, there were no personal messages, no missed calls from family, no reminders of a home waiting for him. He didn't let himself dwell on that. Success required sacrifice. That's what he always believed. Tonight, however, something felt different. A hollow sensation gnawed at him, though he couldn't quite place why. He dismissed it as exhaustion and downed the rest of his drink, deciding he needed a change of scenery. The monotony of business deals and corporate banquets weighed on him, and for once, he craved something unscripted. Cipriani South Beach was packed. The chatter of high-profile guests, the clinking of wine glasses, and the murmur of a live jazz band filled the air. It was the kind of place where Alexander usually felt at home, where deals were made between bites of caviar, where the rich and powerful gathered in an unspoken competition of who could flaunt their wealth more effortlessly. He had barely been seated when his eyes caught something unusual. At a table near the corner, outside the sphere of Miami's elite, sat a woman and a child. The boy, no older than 7, had soft, dark curls and eyes full of curiosity. His small hands struggled to grip a spoon as his mother, her long brown hair tucked behind her ears, guided it carefully to his lips. She smiled, patient, whispering words of encouragement. The boy tried again, his determination unwavering, despite the tremor in his fingers. Alexander watched, transfixed. It wasn't pity that held him there, nor was it fascination with the woman's features, though there was a quiet strength in her, something he couldn't quite define. No, it was something deeper, something unsettlingly familiar. There was love in the way she moved, in the way she spoke, in the way she cared. A kind of love he had not felt in years, a kind of love he had ignored, convinced it was secondary to ambition. He forced himself to look away, but the image lingered. It stirred something buried, something he had long dismissed. A memory of small hands gripping handlebars, of a boy's laughter echoing against the walls of a mansion too large for just 2 people. His jaw tightened. The last time he had seen his son, Ethan, had been through a screen. A video call from across the world, squeezed between board meetings and investor briefings. The boy had spoken little, answering in short phrases, his voice detached. He had grown distant. At the time, Alexander had justified it. He provided for Ethan, private school, a trust fund, a future most could only dream of. That was enough, wasn't it? Yet, watching the woman and her son, doubt seeped into his conviction. Mr. Carter. The waiter's voice pulled him back. He blinked, the weight of his thoughts heavier than before. Yes, he cleared his throat. A Negroni. The night carried on as usual. Chatter, laughter, the undercurrent of business negotiations. Yet, for the first time in years, Alexander felt disconnected from it all. The world he had built suddenly felt cold. As he left the restaurant, he stole one last glance at the woman and the boy. Something inside him told him this moment would not leave him easily. The drive back to his penthouse was quiet, but Alexander's mind was anything but. The image of the woman and her son replayed in his thoughts, blending with memories he had buried long ago. He gripped the steering wheel. his jaw tight as he tried to shake the discomfort gnawing at his chest. Arriving at his residence, he loosened his tie and poured another drink, but even the warmth of the whiskey did little to silence his thoughts. He reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over a familiar contact, Ethan. The last message exchange between them was months old. "Happy birthday." 2 words sent out of obligation, met with a simple thanks. He hesitated before pressing call. The phone rang once, then a click. "Hello." Ethan's voice was distant, as if he had already checked out of the conversation. Alexander cleared his throat. "Hey Ethan. How are you?" Beat of silence. "I'm fine." A strained pause followed. "Listen, I was thinking we could get dinner sometime. Maybe catch up." Another silence. Then Ethan's voice, edged with indifference. "I'm busy, Dad." Alexander swallowed hard. "All right. Maybe another time." "Yeah, maybe." Blick. Alexander stared at the phone. The rejection was sharper than he expected. He had known for years that the gap between them had widened, but tonight, for the first time, it truly felt unbridgeable. The warmth in that restaurant, the mother's gentle patience, the boy's determination, it haunted him. It was everything he had failed to be. Alexander set his glass down, running a hand over his face. For the first time in a long time, he questioned if all he had built was worth what he had lost. And for the first time he feared the answer. The next evening, Alexander found himself back at Cipriani South Beach. It wasn't a planned visit. At least, that's what he told himself. He had no meetings, no business partners to impress. Yet something had drawn him back. The memory of the woman and her son had lingered too vividly in his mind. The restaurant was just as lively as the night before, with Miami's elite indulging in their usual displays of wealth. But Alexander's eyes searched for something different, someone different, and then he saw her. Elena Morales was moving between tables, balancing plates with practiced ease. There was a quiet grace in her efficiency, a warmth in the way she spoke to each customer. Despite the demands of her job, she never appeared rushed or burdened. She was simply present, in a way Alexander had never been. His gaze drifted to the far side of the restaurant, where Diego sat at a small table near the kitchen. He was scribbling on a napkin with a crayon, his tongue peeking out in concentration. Every so often he looked up, searching the restaurant until his eyes found Elena. And when they did, a contented smile spread across his face. It was a smile of certainty, of trust. Alexander exhaled slowly, trying to ignore the unease stirring in his chest. "Would you like to order, sir?" The voice startled him. He looked up to find Elena standing beside his table, pen poised over a notepad. Up close, he noticed the faint circles beneath her eyes, the way her hair was neatly tied back but a few strands had escaped, framing her face. She looked exhausted but still held herself with quiet resilience. Alexander hesitated. This wasn't business. He wasn't used to initiating conversations without a clear objective. What was he even doing here? "I'll have the usual," he said, before realizing she had no way of knowing what that was. Elena simply nodded. "And what would that be?" A flicker of amusement crossed her features, and for a moment, Alexander felt disarmed. He cleared his throat. "A Negroni. And the filet mignon, medium rare." "Good choice." She scribbled on the notepad. "Would you like a side with that? Or is the existential crisis enough?" Alexander blinked. Then, unexpectedly, a small chuckle escaped him. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him so directly, without fear or pretense. Elena arched a brow, waiting. "Truffle mashed potatoes," he said, shaking his head with a smirk. "Coming right up." She turned to leave but hesitated. "You were here last night too." It wasn't a question. Alexander met her gaze. "I was." She studied him for a moment before nodding and walking away. He watched as she returned to Diego's table, crouching beside him to examine his drawing. The boy's face lit up as he explained something with animated gestures, and Elena listened as if it were the most important thing in the world. Alexander realized then what had unsettled him so much about them. They had something he had never possessed, something money had never bought him. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could afford the cost of not having it. Alexander left Cipriani that night feeling something unfamiliar, a sense of restlessness that followed him back to his penthouse. He had spent decades perfecting the art of control, ensuring that every deal, every decision, was executed with precision. Yet, when it came to his own son, he had no control at all. The following morning, he found himself staring at his phone again. His last conversation with Ethan had been brief and hollow, but maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to fix things. His fingers hovered over the call button before he changed his mind and sent a text instead. "Dinner this week. Your choice of place. Let's catch up." The response came faster than he expected. "Busy." A sharp exhale left his lips. It wasn't anger that he felt, at least not entirely. It was something deeper, something far more painful. He leaned back against his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had spent years believing that providing for Ethan was enough, that expensive gifts, elite schools, and a trust fund would compensate for his absence. But last night at Cipriani, watching Diego's unwavering trust in Elena, had shattered that illusion. Love wasn't given in grand gestures. It was built in small, everyday moments. Moments he had never given Ethan. Determined, he grabbed his keys and left his penthouse. By afternoon, he stood outside Ethan's school, leaning against his sleek black Aston Martin. Students trickled out in groups, laughter and chatter filling the air. Alexander's eyes scanned the crowd until he spotted his son. Ethan walked alone, earphones in, hood pulled over his head. He had grown taller, his once boyish face sharper now. When had that happened? When had his child stopped looking like a child? Alexander stepped forward. "Ethan." The boy looked up, surprised, before his expression hardened. He pulled out his earphones. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you." Alexander hesitated. "Talk." Ethan glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. "We don't talk, Dad. We exchange a few words once a year and call it a relationship." The bluntness of it stung. But he had earned that. "I'm trying," Alexander admitted. Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Trying now? After all these years? I know I haven't been there the way I should have." The words felt foreign in his mouth, an admission of failure he had never dared to make before. "But I want to be now." Ethan studied him for a moment, and for the briefest second, Alexander thought he saw something soften in his son's expression. But then Ethan shook his head. "You can't just show up and expect everything to be okay." He adjusted his backpack. "I have to go." And just like that he walked away. Alexander stood there, watching as his son disappeared into the crowd. For the first time in his life, he realized that no amount of money could fix what he had broken. Alexander found himself outside Cipriani again the next evening. This time, he didn't sit at his usual table among Miami's elite. Instead, he took a seat near the back, where he had a clear view of Elena and Diego. He wasn't sure why he had come, perhaps because the encounter with Ethan had left him feeling more lost than ever. He needed answers, and for some reason he thought he might find them here. Elena moved gracefully between tables, her presence warm and attentive. She paused by Diego's side every few minutes, ruffling his hair, whispering encouragement as he carefully worked through his meal. The ease of their connection fascinated Alexander. It was effortless, real, something he had never shared with his own son. Elena caught him watching. This time, she didn't wait for him to order. She walked straight to his table, arms crossed. "You again," she said, tilting her head. "I assume you're not here just for the Negroni." Alexander smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe I just like the atmosphere." She arched a brow. "Or maybe you're searching for something you don't know how to name." That caught him off guard. He leaned back, studying her. There was an honesty in her tone, an ability to see through his carefully crafted exterior that unsettled him. "You're direct," he noted. "I don't have time to be anything else," she said simply. Then, after a pause, she pulled out the chair across from him. "So, what is it you're trying to figure out?" Alexander hesitated. He wasn't used to personal conversations. Business was easy, numbers, contracts, negotiations. But this was uncharted territory. "I have a son," he admitted. "Ethan. 14. And I don't know him at all." Elena's gaze softened. "You must have been busy," she said, though there was no malice in her words, only understanding. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Alexander continued. "Providing for him. Giving him everything I never had growing up. But not giving him you," Elena finished for him. He looked away. That truth was too sharp, too painful. Elena sighed. "Diego doesn't have a lot, Mr. Carter. But he has me. And for him, that's enough." Alexander glanced at the boy, who was now scribbling something on a napkin, his tongue peeking out in concentration. Every few moments, he would look up, making sure Elena was still close. The trust in his eyes was unwavering. "What if it's too late?" Alexander asked, barely recognizing his own voice. Elena leaned forward slightly. "Then stop wasting time wondering and do something about it." For the first time in years, Alexander didn't have a rebuttal. As Elena stood to leave, he found himself asking, "Would you have dinner with me sometime?" She blinked, surprised, then let out a soft laugh. "You don't give up, do you?" "I don't know how." She considered him for a long moment, then shook her head. "Then use that persistence for something that actually matters." With that, she walked away, leaving Alexander alone with thoughts that refused to be ignored. The following morning, Alexander sat in his high-rise office, staring at the skyline of Miami. A sleek, minimalist desk stretched before him, covered in reports, emails, and a contract worth billions. The proposed merger was the biggest deal of his career, one that would cement his company's dominance in the industry. And yet, for the first time in his life, it felt like just another meaningless number. His mind was elsewhere, on Ethan, on Elena's words, on the unmistakable warmth in Diego's eyes whenever he looked at his mother. A sharp knock on the glass door pulled him back. "Alex, we need your final decision on the merger." David Lutz, his CFO and longtime business partner, stepped in, holding a thick folder. "Investors are waiting." Alexander exhaled, rubbing his temple. "What's the projection if we move forward?" "Unprecedented growth. Our valuation would double within the next 5 years." "And if I step back?" David hesitated. "Step back." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "What if I take a break? Real one. Not a weekend off, not a phone call between flights. Just time away." David blinked, clearly not expecting this conversation. "Alex, this deal is everything you've worked for. You walk away now, and we risk losing leverage." "I'm not talking about walking away completely," Alexander clarified. "I'm talking about shifting priorities. I've spent my whole life chasing numbers. And I'm starting to realize I've been measuring the wrong kind of success." David set the folder down, studying him. "Is this about Ethan?" Alexander didn't answer immediately. He didn't have to. The silence said enough. David sighed. "Look, I get it. You're seeing things differently now. But you're not the only one invested in this company. You stepping back affects everyone." "I know," Alexander admitted. "But I also know I've spent years thinking of everyone except my own son." David's expression softened. "You think taking time off will fix things? I think not taking time off will make sure it never does." A long pause settled between them before David finally nodded. "All right, I'll handle things on my end. But I won't lie, Alex. This isn't going to sit well with the board." "They'll adapt," Alexander said simply. "They always do." As David left, Alexander exhaled deeply. The decision wasn't easy, but for the first time in years it felt right. His phone buzzed. New message. Elena Morales. If you're serious about doing something that matters, then prove it. Alexander stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. Alexander Carter, I will. Alexander sat in his car outside Ethan's school again, gripping the steering wheel. The conversation with David earlier still weighed on him, but nothing compared to the uncertainty of what he was about to do. Would Ethan even listen this time? Would he care that his father was finally trying? The last conversation had ended in rejection. A deserved one, no doubt, but still, it gnawed at him. He had built billion-dollar deals from nothing, negotiated with world leaders, and outmaneuvered the fiercest competitors. Yet, when it came to his own son, he was at a loss. There was no strategy for rebuilding trust. No shortcut. The bell rang, and students flooded out. Alexander spotted Ethan immediately. He wasn't alone this time. Two friends walked beside him, laughing about something on their phones. For once, Ethan looked happy. Alexander hesitated. Would approaching him in front of his friends make it worse? Before he could decide, Ethan looked up. Their eyes met. For a brief second, something flickered in his son's expression. Surprise, maybe even curiosity. But then it was gone, replaced by the same guarded indifference. Ethan turned back to his friends and walked away. Alexander felt the rejection like a blow to the chest. He hadn't even been given a chance to speak. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he exhaled slowly. This is what I deserve. Years of absence couldn't be undone in a few weeks. He had to keep trying. Instead of driving off, he pulled out his phone and opened a blank message. He started typing, then deleted it. Too formal. Too detached. After a moment he wrote, Alexander Carter. I won't stop trying, Ethan. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. He stared at the message before pressing send. He had no idea if Ethan would respond. Maybe he never would. But for the first time in a long time, Alexander wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions. He started the car and drove off, a new thought forming in his mind. If he couldn't fix his past mistakes with Ethan right away, maybe he could start by learning what it meant to truly be there for someone. And he knew exactly where to begin. Alexander found himself outside Elena's apartment complex in Little Havana, a stark contrast to the luxury of his own high-rise world. The narrow streets were lined with aging buildings, laundry hanging from balconies, and the scent of home-cooked meals drifting through open windows. It was a place filled with life. Messy, imperfect, but undeniably real. For a moment he hesitated. Did he even belong here? He stepped out of his car and walked up the stairs, knocking on the worn wooden door. Moments later it opened, revealing Elena with an arched brow. You actually showed up, she said, crossing her arms. I told you I would, he replied. She studied him for a second before stepping aside. Come in then. The apartment was small but warm, filled with little signs of a life well lived. Photos of Diego on the walls, books stacked on the coffee table, a half-finished puzzle spread out on the dining table. Diego sat on the floor playing with toy cars. When he saw Alexander, his eyes lit up with curiosity. Hi, the boy said. Alexander crouched slightly to meet his gaze. Hi, Diego. Elena walked to the kitchen. You came all this way. What exactly are you hoping to find? He exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. Perspective. She glanced over her shoulder. On how to fix something I've spent years breaking. Elena turned fully to face him, her expression softening. You can't undo the past, Alexander. But you can decide what to do with what's left. He nodded, his gaze shifting back to Diego. The boy was now struggling to fit two toy cars together. His fingers trembled slightly, his frustration growing. Diego, Elena said gently, crouching beside him. Take your time. You'll get it. Diego nodded, biting his lip in concentration. Alexander watched, fascinated. The patience, the reassurance. It was such a simple moment, yet it held more weight than anything he had ever given Ethan. Do you want to try? Elena's voice pulled him back. He blinked. What? She gestured to Diego's cars. "Help him." Alexander hesitated, but then lowered himself to the floor. Diego looked at him expectantly. How long had it been since he had done something like this? Since he had simply existed in the moment with another person. He reached out, guiding Diego's hand slowly. "Like this." Diego nodded eagerly. "Yeah, like that." Elena smiled, watching them. And in that moment, Alexander realized something. This wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about money or success. It was about showing up over and over again. And maybe, just maybe, this was where his real success would begin. The next morning, Alexander sat in his office, staring at the contract for the merger. The numbers were staggering. The deal would make his company one of the most powerful in the industry, cementing his legacy forever. But that legacy had already cost him too much. His mind drifted back to the night before, helping Diego with his toy cars, seeing the pride in his eyes when he finally fit them together. The way Elena had looked at him, not with admiration for his wealth, but with something far more valuable, respect for simply being there. His phone buzzed. "David. Tell me you're signing the contract today," David said without preamble. "The board is getting restless." Alexander exhaled. "I'm not moving forward with it." Silence. Then, "Alex, this is insanity. You've worked your entire life for this moment." "Exactly," Alexander said. "And that's the problem." David let out a frustrated sigh. "You think walking away fixes anything? What are you going to do, take up charity work?" "I'm going to take up living," Alexander corrected. "For once in my life, I'm going to focus on something other than a balance sheet." David was quiet for a long time. "The board won't like this." "They'll survive," Alexander replied. "So will the company." He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, feeling lighter than he had in years. For the first time, he had made a decision that wasn't about power, money, or control. It was about something real. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. "Ethan, Mom said you called off the merger." Alexander hesitated before replying. "Alexander, I did." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "Ethan, why?" Alexander swallowed hard. "'Cause I'm trying. 'Cause I want to be here. Because I don't want to lose you." Instead he typed, "Alexander, because some things matter more." This time, Ethan didn't leave him on read. "Ethan, okay." It was the smallest response. But for Alexander it was everything. A week had passed since Alexander walked away from the merger. In that time he had sent 2 more messages to Ethan. One about a new art exhibit opening downtown, the other about a basketball game he knew his son liked. Neither received a response. Yet something was different. Ethan hadn't ignored him completely. The conversation wasn't closed. That was enough for now. Tonight, however, he wasn't thinking about work or unanswered messages. He was standing outside Elena's apartment, holding a brown paper bag filled with takeout. He had offered to take her and Diego out to dinner, but she had smiled and said, "Let's start with something simple." So here he was, doing something simple. When Elena opened the door, she glanced at the bag and smirked. "Did you actually buy food that doesn't cost half a paycheck?" Alexander chuckled. "There's a first time for everything." Inside, Diego was already waiting on the floor, eyes bright. "Did you get the garlic bread?" Alexander handed him the bag. "See for yourself." The boy dug inside and let out a triumphant cheer when he found it. Elena laughed softly, and for a moment Alexander just stood there, taking it in. The warmth, the ease, the complete absence of everything artificial. Over dinner, Diego told exaggerated stories about school, while Elena teased Alexander about his lack of knowledge on everyday things. How to use a laundromat, what a grocery store's discount aisle looked like. He took it all in stride, amused at how different this world was from his own. At one point, as Diego was distracted with his food, Elena leaned in slightly. "I can tell you're trying." Alexander met her gaze. "Trying isn't enough, is it?" She shook her head but smiled. "No. But it's a start." After dinner, as Alexander was about to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another business email. Instead, it was a message that made him freeze. "Ethan, dinner. Tomorrow." Alexander stared at the screen, rereading the words. A slow breath left him, his fingers tightening around the phone. Elena noticed the shift in his expression. "Good news." He swallowed and looked at her. For the first time in years, he had something more valuable than a business deal. He had a second chance. "Yeah," he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Really good news." The next evening, Alexander arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early. He sat at a corner table, hands resting on the polished wood, watching the entrance. The last time he had waited for Ethan, he had felt nothing but impatience. Tonight it was different. Tonight he was just grateful for the chance. At exactly 7, Ethan walked in. No hesitation, no last-minute excuse. He found Alexander easily, nodded once, and sat down. Neither spoke for a few seconds, the silence thick with unspoken words. Then Ethan picked up the menu. "So, what's good here?" Alexander exhaled, a slow smile forming. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't an emotional confession. But it was something. It was a beginning. What does it really mean to be successful? Is it the fortune you build, the power you hold, or the people you choose to share your life with? Alexander spent years chasing wealth, only to realize the true cost of his ambition. But now, standing at the crossroads between the life he built and the connections he lost, he faces a new challenge. Can he truly change, or is it too late to rewrite his story? Click on the video on your screen to continue this journey of self-discovery. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that makes you question what truly matters. See you in the next one.